Hey, what's going on, guys? Dom the Movie Nerd here, and have you heard the good word? Game of Thrones is back! Well, not really, but the first official spin-off, House of the Dragon, is set to premiere next year on HBO, and that got me thinking about how Game of Thrones, the #1 most-watched show for a decade, just seemingly disappeared from the culture after that god-awful finale. And I wanted to find out why, which is why I'm proud to present the newest hit show from the Talkin' TV network, Talkin' Thrones, the new weekly show where myself and friend of the channel, Professor Pat Huber, get together to break down each and every single episode of this hit show. We've got focus character segments, we break down the lore, we go over some old reviews, all to get to the question of where did this show go wrong? It's a really fun time. You guys are not going to want to miss this. So head over to the Talkin' TV channel on YouTube and Spotify to check it out. We go live every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Audio goes up the following Saturday. It's going to be a really great time as we once again battle it out for the throne. All right, people, only 5 more weeks until the year is done. Only 5 more episodes of the Talkin' TV podcast, and we've got a new one. We've got a big one to give to you guys today. Amazon Prime officially making their next move in the streaming wars, and I have with me a brand new host, completely new to the channel, completely new to the world of podcasts. I figured, hey, I'd give him a shot. Mr. Eli Holicky. Eli, how you doing, dude?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course, man. Yeah, you're somebody who I definitely, specifically for this subject that we're about to talk about today, I definitely was somebody that I had to have on. But we're talking about the series premiere of Wheel of Time. This is a show that has been being hyped up for quite a while now. All that and more. Stay tuned. All right, people. So we're here to talk about Wheel of Time, and I have with me probably the #1 biggest Wheel of Time, just biggest. Or I thought that I was a fantasy nerd just in general when it came to different fantasy novels and their adaptation to the big screen, but I don't think I've met as big a one here. So please give a warm welcome for the first time on the channel and for his first time ever podcasting, Mr. Eli Holicky. Dude, you've been talking to me a bit about wanting to start your own podcast, just in general. So how is it? How do you feel now knowing that you're on a podcast talking about probably the thing that you've wanted to talk about for the longest time?
It makes me feel great. I'm just really glad I have this opportunity. I've been looking for something like this for a very, very long time, and I'm really glad I can finally be a part of something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of fascinating when you just talk about podcasting in general and the initial difficulty that there may be when you start out, and then you realize, oh, it's just talking and occasionally it's in front of a camera. If not, it's just having a conversation with your friend. It's kind of to me, why it is becoming the mainstream form of just media and audio consumption just in general. People inherently there's a reason why radio has been a thing for the longest time. People inherently like hearing other people talk about the things that they enjoy talking about. They like hearing that common mindset. That's sort of agreement, that validation for that thing that they love. And you are probably I'm honestly gonna let you handle the majority of this conversation, because this is an area I'll admit I am not the most knowledgeable of. I heard that Amazon had bought the rights to this book series. I'd heard that this book series was pretty pretty damn well known just in general. And for me, at least, from what I heard, I'm okay, we know that they're making their Lord of the Rings TV series, right? They're obviously using this as a precursor. They're trying to jump into the fantasy game just in general. But break it down for me, Eli. What exactly is the Wheel of Time book series, and why is it that people should be looking forward to this potentially as the next big must-watch show?
So the Wheel of Time is a 14-book plus a prequel series where all the books are close to about 1,000 pages each. So it's a big read. It took me personally over a year to read all of them. Super long series, but in my opinion, it is one of the greatest fantasy series ever written. It's right up there with Lord of the Rings, right up there with Game of Thrones. Has a lot of just amazing characters, and it asks a lot of interesting questions about the nature of humanity, about your own evil and fighting your own demons, and just pressure and just expectations and just destiny confronting, your past and things like that. And it's an amazing series. It truly is. And I think that Amazon choosing to adapt something like this is very bold, because it's not an easy thing to adapt. But I think Amazon choosing to adapt the Wheel of Time shows like it really speaks to their ambition and like what they're really going for. And it shows they're in it for the long haul. It really does.
Well, we obviously know that Amazon is no small feat, obviously, both just as a company and then when it comes to their media branding, they kind of like made their stamp within the superhero genre already with shows like The Boys and Invincible. And the thing about Amazon that I've noticed about a lot of their shows that they put forth is they're not the company that needs to have like the constant it thing like every couple months. They don't need to have like the most recognizable brand. They don't even really need to like kind of have all, this consistent like growing amount of subscribers just in general because of how long they've been around. The whole thing that I've noticed about Amazon is that whenever they have a show out, it could be the only show that they could really have, that it seems like, because you look at their library, they've got like a decently extensive library, but like not the way that Netflix does, not the way that Hulu does, not the way that HBO Max does already. But whenever they have a show out, it is like the thing that everyone is talking about. Like I still remember when The Boys first dropped 2 years ago back in 2019, and like what a phenomenon that was. And obviously last year, during the pandemic, we had The Boys season 2 that dropped, and that was dropping week to week. And then obviously you had Invincible earlier this year, and that like had a tremendous impact, right? But I think that what's interesting just about kind of Amazon's direction and approach to this is the fact that they don't seem to be wanting to be like the most relevant subject matter, which is interesting given that I feel like that's something that a lot of these other streaming giants seem to be missing, is that everyone is still trying to capture the it moment, that it show, right? They're still trying to hunker down on the Game of Thrones kind of like hole that was left behind. And after Game of Thrones left, there were a couple different shows that it seemed like it could take the spot. For a minute, it seemed like it was going to be The Mandalorian. For another minute, it seemed like it was going to be Succession. But I think this is what's interesting here, is that Amazon, obviously we know they have all the money in the world just in general, but they seem to be focusing on the biggest, most mainstream genres that they know that people are into. And fantasy, right? Fantasy is a genre that's been, I feel like, a little bit on the back burner, because for the longest time, it felt like Game of Thrones just so occupied that space, right? And so it felt like after Game of Thrones ended, both between, obviously, with the way that show ended and with how the pandemic, and then with the pandemic coming, it almost felt like we like had a little bit of a break. But now between Netflix doing the Witcher series, now Amazon doing this and Lord of the Rings, I don't know, it almost seems like fantasy is like ready to make a comeback, which is strange, because it's like, you tell me, it feels like that, like, before Game of Thrones, it felt like there really hadn't been one big thing since Lord of the Rings. Like, I don't know. What's your take on that?
No, I completely agree. I think Game of Thrones was really that show that just IP to really just push the fantasy genre back into relevancy. I think just the show in general just was, think about how much it impacted just like pop culture and things like that. Like everyone was talking about it when it was on TV. I mean, it was all over Twitter, Instagram, just everything. Everyone was talking about it. It was the show. And I think people like realize that, people like at Amazon, like Netflix and things like that, they realize this, and they're like, hey, people are into this kind of stuff, this kind of like more fictional, fantastical, elements, that it's like really drawing people in. And I think fantasy itself, I think the genre is a really good medium for telling stories, just because you can express ideas in a much better way through fantasy than you can through like real life, in my opinion. I think we'll kind of get into that more with the conversation. Yeah. But
well, I mean, just from the storytelling aspect itself, like it helps with the escapist like value just in general. Like I feel like I know Chris and I have had so many discussions about this over the last 2 years now, where it feels like so many, I should say, of the movies and ideas that we're getting are just so trying to cram the message down your throat. They're so trying to be like so relevant of today, which both to me, like kind of destroys the idea of storytelling, because stories in and of themselves are supposed to be timeless. They're not supposed to be like specifically relevant and remind you of a specific like moment that you're in. But also it's the fact that just it kind of destroys the escapist value of it. And it's like you go into stories in order to like kind of, get lost in a world, get lost in like a different thing. And you're right, fantasy definitely, I feel like, kind of brings a lot of that to light. And I guess that's why I feel like when a bad fantasy property comes out, it just makes it that much worse because it's like, wow, not only were you just not well made for whatever reason, you also just kind of destroyed the fantasy, like kind of the escapist element of it, which it's like, I feel like that to me is like the number one instance that shows that you have a bad property on your hands, which is that the escapist value is automatically destroyed. So I wanted to talk about a little bit of the history behind this because like you said, this has been, it was a long-running book series. It was a very popular book. What did you say? This was like the second like most popular fantasy series, like behind the Game of Thrones books. Like it was right up there, something like that.
I believe, I haven't checked it in a while, but I believe it is the second or third highest selling fantasy series of all time. Yeah, Lord of the Rings is obviously number one with like over 150 million copies sold. I believe Game of Thrones is close to around 90 million. And then I believe Wheel of Time is just over 80 million.
That's crazy. So like this, honestly, like after Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, this really does like have the potential to like be like the next like it kind of fantasy show. But kind of like just to give a little background. So this has had a long period of production history. So obviously famous. So back in 2000, actually NBC optioned the screen rights to the novel series, but they didn't end up proceeding with the production. Then in 2004, Robert Jordan sold the film, television, video game, and comic rights series to production company Red Eagle Entertainment. And then in 2015, Red Eagle paid airtime to FXX to air Winter Dragon, which was a 22-minute pilot for a potential Wheel of Time series starring Billy Zane and Max Ryan. That allowed Red Eagle to hold, but that was just one of the things that studios do all the time where they just make something just so that they can retain the rights to it. Fox literally did that like all with every single Fantastic Four movie. Not to mention that subsequently the company actually sued Robert Jordan's widow, Harriet McDougal, for her comments about the pilot. That lawsuit being settled in 2016. That's actually kind of crazy ultimately. Yeah. But it looks like official development on this show, this specific iteration that we have, occurred around April of 2017. It was originally Sony Pictures Television that was going to do that. What's it called? It looks like it originally had a different showrunner. Rafe Judkins was expected to serve along with a bunch of other people. McDougal set to serve as consulting producer, but by October 2018, the series had been in development for a year, and Amazon agreed to produce it. And pretty much everything else played out from there with the director of these first couple episodes, Uda Breshowitz, confirmed as the director. Casting, obviously, casting obviously resulted from there, and it looks like obviously the filming was halted due to the COVID 2019 pandemic. But so now we have the first couple episodes, and so break it down for us, Eli. So the first couple episodes is an adaptation of the first book. Are any of the books in the series like do they do that thing where it's like, because obviously we know that the Game of Thrones books, the name of the series is A Song of Ice and Fire, but the first book is a Game of Thrones, when people now collectively know it as Game of Thrones. Is this a thing where Wheel of Time is definitively the name of the series? Like there are no books in the series that are named the Wheel of Time?
Yes, this is the actual name of the series. Each individual book has its own separate title. The first book that the show is primarily following is called The Eye of the World.
Okay, so and that's what these first couple episodes are adapting.
Yes. Okay,
got it. So ultimately, the show is following. It looks like a what's it called? So it takes place obviously in a. So now, real quick. So remind me, this is obviously not supposed to be our world, right? This is supposed to be like a completely different world.
You're made to believe that, yes.
Okay, got it. Yeah, so it looks like it's following Moraine, who is Rosamund Pike's character, who's a member of this. It looks like this like ancient, like all-female sorcerer group called the Aes Sedai. Let me know if I'm pronouncing that right. What's it called? So the whole thing is that in this world, women are the only ones that can use magic, because whenever males get the ability to use magic, they cause all sorts of wanton destruction within the world. Because basically the whole thing is that she is attempting to stop the rebirth of this figure called the dragon, I guess, which is what and like I said, you'll be able to fill me in a lot more as I'm like trying to stumble through like the basic plot of what it looks like. This is basically just like kind of what they all like the whole prologue told me within the first episode with all the voiceover. And because it looks like that this figure, the dragon, what's called, calls all sorts of wanton damage back in the day. And now it looks like the dragon has been reborn within a potential of 4 people in this village of, let me see here, in this village of Emmons Field. What's it called? And it's one of 4 villagers that it could be ultimately. And she arrives in the village and ultimately ends up protecting them when they're attacked by these beasts called Trollocs, and ultimately starts leading them on this quest as they head towards, I guess, their headquarters, the White Tower or something like that. So that was probably just like my best attempt to explain like the plot. So Eli, you take it from there. Like kind of what exactly is going to happen? Like what are we in for just as far as going forward? Like plot-wise here?
Well, honestly, for someone who's never read the books, I applaud you. That was a
Oh, thank you.
fantastic summary. You
Thank you.
got almost everything right.
That's
So
good.
yes, Moraine's Rosamund Pike's character Moraine is part of a group called the Aes Sedai, which pronunciation you were almost there, right? It was
I'm usually
very
pretty on point with my fantasy pronunciations.
yes, and so Aes Sedai kind of couple as both political figures and kind of these like protectors of humanity. Obviously, the show will dive into it a little more, and we've had hints to stuff. I'll try to be as I guess close to the first three episodes as I can without throwing in too much information that we'll probably get later on. But yes, so at this point in the world, in the history of the world, men who get the ability to use magic, they call it channeling, go insane. And that is because of this taint, or they call it a taint, but it's like this infection or this touch by the Dark One, who is like this evil god we've only heard about in name, right? And obviously they dive into that a little more. But a long time ago, there was this figure called the Dragon, and he was like the chosen one. Basically, he was the most powerful channeler. He was the one rising up against the Dark One in this like ancient historical war that was like thousands of years ago, and he was like the humanity's hope. Basically, he was like their Superman. He was their shining beacon, through
Sounds
the
like
darkness.
essentially their Anakin Skywalker.
Exactly, he's very much like an Anakin Skywalker, and he himself took an army to fight the Dark One, an army of all men, I will say that, and he managed to seal away the Dark One in this prison, which they've mentioned in the show. It's called Shale Ghul, and with the Dark One's last, last spit in the face before he was sealed away, he tainted the male half of, they call it the One Power in the show, just the ability to use magic. He tainted the male half of the One Power, and that is why when men try to channel, they go insane. And obviously, Rosamund Pike's character in her monologue at the very beginning of the show, she talks about how the world broke. That is very literal. The world literally was shattered. Like continents were reshaped. It was like, because when men were beginning to first go insane, like how do you fight, a quarter of your population going insane with like all these powers throwing fireballs and controlling the weather and things like that? And as you can imagine, there was a lot of destruction. So even thousands of years after this happened, humanity is still kind of picking up the pieces, and just it's a really interesting setting, I think, for a story like this.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, so it sounds like obviously they're wanting to prevent something like that happening again. So it sounds to me like not quite the equivalent of like Sauron and like the forces like kind of all combining in order to stop him at the beginning, but it almost kind of does. Where obviously the whole impetus being that you have all these forces for good that team up against this one force of evil. They succeed, but the force of evil manages to leave behind one thing that like starts to fracture the good guys potentially, what's it called? Levy the path for him to return ultimately at some point is what it sounds like. So now break it down for me ultimately. So what happens, I guess, when / if, right? So now we're into like a little bit of speculative territory. So I guess what happens when / if this dragon person is reborn ultimately? Like, is it a thing of where like the world goes through something similar? Is it where a thing that like the Aes Sedai are trying to like prevent it from happening, but like Moraine is the one that could see, oh no, this could potentially be good for us? Like, break it down. Like, what kind of is the implication? Like, how bad are we talking if this dragon is reborn within one of these 4 villagers that we've met so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the only remaining pieces of like historical text that they have surviving from those ancient days of the first dragon are these prophecies that are like saying that he's going to be reborn, and that's kind of getting into the whole theme of the series. So it's called the Wheel of Time. Basically, the way they believe time and just the world works is that time is cyclical. Time is a wheel. Like all of history is a wheel, and the wheel is always spinning. Time is always continuing. That's why they say like ages come and pass. History repeats itself. That's a huge theme with the series as a whole. And basically, some of these prophecies of the dragon say that he will break the world again. Some say he will destroy the Dark One and save all of humanity, and some say that just he will become the new Dark One or things like that, or just all kinds of these evil things. And it depends on who really is the dragon, right? We know it's one of our protagonists from Emmonsfield, the Two Rivers area. So we have 3 males and 1 female that it possibly could be. If it's the female, obviously that could make things a little easier. With them being a woman, they don't have to go mad, obviously. Obviously, women are much more accepted at the White Tower than men are. And
Right.
excuse me. I think if it is one of our male characters, that speaks to a lot of problems, like potentially down the road.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
No, you're good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very fascinating just in general, kind of where this is the first, and I love when fantasy TV shows can do this. I think that this is one of the things that Game of Thrones did really well, is I love when you could have you could drop these first 3 episodes like they did, and all of them, they still leave you feeling like kind of some sense of open-endedness. Right? You don't necessarily feel like you're getting a complete story within each episode, but it still kind of leaves you interested to find out what happens next, right? So basically, kind of the impetus being that I remember obviously a lot of the criticism that the first season of Game of Thrones got was the fact that the first episodes were very deliberately paced. What's it called? Each episode didn't necessarily feel like an open and shut case. It definitely. And obviously, there was a lot of points where critics were asking, okay, where is this going? We don't necessarily know what's going to happen next, and that's kind of a little bit of what I'm getting from these first 3 episodes. So I guess if I can get into my spoiler-free thoughts on these episodes in general, it is that I didn't necessarily, for me, somebody who's never read the books, right? Although I will say, if the first season definitely turns out the way that I'm hoping it does, I definitely will make me interested to go and read these books, especially if they're as engrossing as you say. And the thing that got me initially was the fact that, okay, this definitely is only still the first third of the story, which again is in and of itself leading you up for this next gigantic story ultimately, because I have a feeling that once whoever is the dragon is revealed, it's going to result in this gigantic battle akin to the final battle in Pelennor Fields of Return of the King, or akin to obviously the battle with the Night King at the end of Game of Thrones. It's going to lead to something like that, which I think is awesome, because it's look, I'm ready for another giant climactic fantastical battle like that. And immediately off the bat, I'm okay, I definitely did not get a complete picture. I still don't necessarily know what we're in for going forward, but what I got surprisingly intrigued me. I don't necessarily know if the acting is the best that it should be, but I also have a feeling that regardless of my thoughts, these actors are going to grow into these characters as time goes on. And I have a feeling that, again, there's a lot that's still not being told to us that obviously leaves us open for the suspense. And I can definitely say that the most intriguing thing to me about these episodes is just the production value. When they said that they were going to go all in for the production value, they meant it. The scenery, I think it looks like they shot this in New Zealand, because I'm seeing a lot of very similar landscapes that I saw in the Lord of the Rings movies, but the scenery, the kind of the world building is just absolutely incredible. I'm definitely engrossed. Every time I turned on an episode, it wasn't necessarily something where it's okay, I was suckered in for the entire time, but I was definitely very, very interested. Kind of the way that the action plays out. I don't know, I missed kind of that fantasy build, and it's so difficult to actually get a good fantasy thing now, because I feel when it does, it has to be the center of everything. I talked about this with The Witcher. The biggest thing for me with The Witcher was I felt that one was trying to have it both ways, where it's it was trying to kind of be this one-off strange episode of the week, and then at the end it kind of tried to tie everything together in a way that didn't necessarily feel super satisfying, not to mention the fact that even though it did its best, it still had the Netflix budget, and we all know how Netflix is when it comes to their budget. But Amazon, they actually have some money in general, they have the money to make this into the biggest thing possible that it could be, and kind of give this book series the treatment that it deserves. So Eli, as somebody who read the books, right? As somebody who was waiting to see, because I'm a Harry Potter fan. Trust me, I know. I'm just as big a stickler as the rest of the guys who need to see that the adaptation of their beloved book series done right. But do you think that they did this adaptation right?
Honestly, I think they do. They made some changes to this part of the books that I think would suit the show better in the long running. Especially that first episode, there were actually 2 characters that they didn't even introduce that are still in the first 3, but they didn't introduce in that first episode. And I think that's perfectly fine, because there's just already way too many characters to introduce and so much to set up just in that time frame for that one episode. So I think the changes that they did make, I think will suit the show better, just moving forward. And apart from that, I do have some criticisms with like the pacing, especially with the first episode. They do kind of just throw you in, and you don't really have a lot of time to kind of process. But I do think overall they did a very good job as someone who has read the books and knows
it was
going.
The biggest thing for me was I'm just following them as they're like going through their average daily village life, and then we're catching up with Moraine, who like we get like the one cool opening scene with Moraine where she's like with the other with those two guys that are running from them, and she's like, oh, it's not them, and then obviously that they stumble upon the village, but then we're following all these characters, and so this to clue people in. So the 4 characters, either of who could be potentially one of the either one of them could be the dragon. Are the names are Randall Thor, Perrin Ibarra, Matt Cathon, and Egwene Alver. Let me know if I got any of those names right.
You got one of them right.
I got one of them right. All right, that's good. So don't worry. As I watch more of these episodes, I'll definitely I'll definitely get it more. So you're following all of them. They seem to be like kind of just like, they seem to be like dopey kids. One of them is like, a farmhand who's in love with the one girl's like trying to be like the town's like healer. The one dude is just like, trying to reconnect with like his girlfriend, and the other one is like just poor all the time. That seems to be like just kind of their setup. And again, it's kind of like it's not the best introduction, I'll say, but I'm like, that could just as easily be how they were introduced in the books. But all of a sudden, I'm like, I feel like I'm following the majority of them for the episode. And I'm kind of like, oh man, are we just gonna like follow these guys for a couple episodes in their village, like get to know them? And it's like, no, immediately like you have these things come in, like the trials start just like immediately like taking down shit. I'm like, whoa, what the hell is going on? What are these things? Yeah. What are they like? They're like part like they look almost like minotaurs in a strange way, but then they can also like run, like they also seem to like have elements of werewolves in them. So I thought that was cool. I'm like, okay, so we're getting like some form of new fantastical creatures that we really haven't seen before. I love it when like and let me know if you like this too. I love it when fantasy properties can like these other fantasy properties can like push and pull like certain things from like other fantasy properties and like mix and mingle, like mesh them to like be their own things. So, like obviously satyrs are like a well-known thing in Greek mythology, but Chronicles of Narnia obviously like did a little bit of a twist on them with fawns.
Yes.
And obviously the giant spiders that are in both Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. Real quick, do we get any giant spiders in this series?
I can't make any promises.
Okay, all right, okay. So that's really interesting. But I think probably for me, I'm a big fan of like visual displays of villainy, right? So much of the time we get the villain that's just monologuing their entire plan away. But the thing that I usually love about fantasy villains, and this is kind of an interesting point because I feel like a lot of the time this usually gets a lot of criticism, is that a fantasy villain, what you'll normally get not necessarily a one overall presence. You'll most of the time get this one like kind of overhanging ethereal presence that is more of like a visual metaphor rather than an actual like antagonistic force. Like to me, obviously we both grew up in the internet age. We've seen every single meme and its mother about how easy it would have been if they just took the eagles to Mordor, and how kind of pointless Sauron is because it's just a floating eye in a tower and all that shit. But I'm like, no, that's what kind of like creates the perfect atmosphere, because think about how sinister it is, right? You're in this fantasy realm, right? You could be in the middle of the woods. And all of a sudden you have these random creatures that could pop out that could kill you. And like just how much more threatening and menacing the tension feels when you have kind of this one looming force overlooking everything, And so like you had like the one figurehead, I'll call it like what's it called? I'll call it like the what's called like the pale face, because it looks like a Guillermo del Toro.
Oh, the eyeless one.
Yeah, exactly, the eyeless one who's like leading the trials. But like I don't know, is that supposed to be like the visual like the representation of this evil? Like what is that thing?
In a way, so in the books, they're actually called Thades, or their proper name. They're kind of the generals for the Trollocs. They are the ones that control the Trollocs, and we assume are kind of getting their information fed by the Dark One himself or by his servants or whatever. And they're meant to be menacing, obviously having no eyes and a mouth full of these sharp, evil-looking teeth. That's definitely gonna put someone off. I mean, I know
claws and everything.
I know when I first saw it in the trailer, I was like, okay, they did that right, it's meant to be horrifying. It's kind of meant to be just like as a young adult being thrusted onto this like adventure, well, not really adventure, but being thrusted away from your home, from the perspective of our protagonist here. You gotta think about what they must be going through and just the fear that encompasses them. And we see like when Rand is arguing with some of the the other characters on their journey, you can tell it's really getting to them, this overarching just fear and pressure that they have. And it's really interesting, in my opinion. Excuse me. Robert Jordan himself, I know you were kind of talking about when fantasy series kind of borrow a lot from each other, and that's exactly what Robert Jordan did with The Wheel of Time. He specifically said he got a lot of his inspiration from The Lord of the Rings, but wanted to tell a more like a hero's journey, sort of in a more realistic setting. That's why when Frodo and Sam are like so willing to leave the Hobbit to take the ring, he said in like an interview he didn't believe that was all that realistic, but he thinks like if they were forced to go, such as like they're being hunted and they want to protect the ones they love, so then they have to leave. He thought that would be a much more interesting narrative.
That's super awesome, because like that's crazy, because like that, so he does kind of follow in like the George R.R. Martin of thinking, where Martin is the exact same way, where his whole thing is, it's like, yeah, I love, he's such a big avid fan of Tolkien, but he's also like, oh, but also like how would Aragorn like enact his tax policy, and how would they like get rid of like how would like the plumbing system in Minas Tirith work, and like all the stuff that it's like you don't really want to see that in a fantasy series, right? You don't really care about that kind of stuff. And I will say that if I could levy one criticism against my beloved Game of Thrones, it almost like got too mired down with that stuff, to the point where it almost like kind of lost focus of what the main journey was. I think that's part of the big reason why we're still avidly waiting for the next book series. But I think that's really interesting that you say that, because almost immediately what I get from watching these first couple episodes is I'm like, okay, this is still following within the realm of the hero's journey. It's not necessarily looking to make it realistic, quote unquote, which I liked, right? I was going to be very, very disappointed if the whole thing that they tried to see was like, oh, these characters are reluctant. Oh, they're mopey. Oh, they're angsty teens. Yeah. Oh, they miss being torn. If they had done that, I would have been like, oh no, this is already starting off on the wrong foot. But they don't do that. Like they have, obviously they have questions. This is not all sunshine and glory. They're being pursued by like, malicious, giant fucking like Minotaur things from the minute they leave home. So like that rest of the part is pretty understandable. But like, it's almost shocking to me when in only the second episode, they like all get split up. Ultimately, like at the very least with Game of Thrones, you had to wait until like the end of the first season before like everyone got split up and went on their own individual journeys, and like and like so much so that you almost forgot like them, like, oh wow, were these guys even together first? But this like immediately throws them into each of their own individual journeys. And I was doing a little bit of reading about the books and just about the book series and like kind of what happens with the books. And I remember that seeing that like one of the criticisms that was launched against the books was that you follow these characters on their own individual journeys for long, long tracks of time. And it feels like whenever they're like on to like about to like start the next phase of the journey, it's almost like something comes along to like mess that up in general, but like obviously we know that can prove really well if it's handled right for long form storytelling, and especially if Amazon wants to give this show as many seasons as they say they do, and they really want to like flesh this out and make this like the next big like long running show. Because that's the other thing too, if we're talking about just shows in general now, it's not like for something to be like a Game of Thrones where it lasts like 7 seasons is a rarity now. Like honestly, if a show just makes it to 3 seasons now, that automatically is like, wow, pat on the back for making it, like a big thing for me ultimately with Game of Thrones that kind of shocked me is how drastically not of a left turn, but like how drastically like the show almost shifts after the Red Wedding, where like there's definitely like this pivot from like the more like slow, deliberate storytelling of like the prestige television drama era to like the more quick cut, rapid fire, gigantic production scale, a lot more battles happening, a lot more deaths happening, a lot more frequently nature of like the more streaming era. Because that was the interesting thing about Game of Thrones, is that it occurred in this really interesting time when television was going through this other shift. But now you have Wheel of Time, and it almost seems to be positioning itself as like the next kind of big interest, because the interesting thing that we've seen with a lot of the streaming shows is you have these shows that come along. They are the biggest things in the moment, right? They've got all the money in the world thrown into them, right? And they're the biggest thing in the moment while they're on the air. But they don't necessarily have like kind of this long overarching like kind of trek forward where they've got like, okay, we've got like the next 5 seasons planned out of the show, because they're mostly just trying to be like, okay, like we don't know if we're going to be able to keep going, but Wheel of Time is the first show that does. This is the first show where it's like, okay, this feels like they've plotted this story out for like seasons to come. And I admire them definitely, because the fact that the fact that Amazon and the fact that this showrunner would have kind of the stones, I'll say, to be able to do that in the era of streaming, when, again, like I said, shows are lucky if they get like 2 seasons. Like Ozark is just now coming to an end. This is only Ozark's 4th season, but it feels like that show's been on forever, just because of like the gap that's been going on. But at the same time, you're like, holy shit, 4 seasons. Like, House of Cards, at the very least, had 6 seasons before they wrapped it up, Right. So that's just kind of the nature of the beast of television, watching and consumption right now. But for me, I feel like kind of what I can kind of contribute to this, as far as like without like knowing too much about the lore in general, is that to me, this feels like the next logical step in kind of this weird transmogrification of media that we've been seeing these last couple of years, where you have, obviously, the more reliable spectacle going to movie theaters, but I ultimately think that movie theaters and kind of the movies that are going to go to them are ultimately, they've already kind of devolved into like its brands is what it is, right, more than anything else, right?
That's what sells.
Exactly. Like you see, obviously, like you get the same batch of summer movies that are usually kind of not reliably terrible, but like they've got that consistent amount of quality that runs throughout the summer. Then you've got the Oscar bait movies that run into the fall, and occasionally you might get something interesting that might shift things up a little bit. But for the most part, that's what theaters are, right? Because that's just the economics of movie theater storytelling. But now more than ever, right? We've been talking for years about kind of the more interesting, fascinating stories that we like, and end up going to television. And now you're seeing, that happen with like one of the biggest, most expensive forms of storytelling with fantasy. Like, I don't know, like talk about that. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. I think it's really interesting to see, even after just COVID and just the shift in how we consume this kind of media. I mean, now a bunch of movies moving to streaming services, and it's kind of the future of just the theater is kind of just a little more uncertain than it has been in a lot of recent years. I think it fascinates me. It really fascinates me, just the way we've seen it kind of evolve. And I think you're right about the fantasy side of things, where we're not really sure where it's going to go, and things like that.
Because the whole thing, right, is that everyone was so certain that theaters were not coming back. Theaters were done, right? Obviously, with them dropping all the movies on the streaming services, right? The problem and what happened there ultimately is that we know that these studios, they gotta collect on their bottom dollar, and it obviously did well boosting for the subscriber numbers, but they ultimately did. It was between both wanting to keep their talent happy, because we know that the talent was not at all happy about the shift to streaming because of how that impacts back end deals and everything of that caliber, and the combination of that, the few movies that they did litmus test. I think HBO Max played a very, very big part in kind of allowing theaters to continue to go to surviving, and there were the few movies that did open up, both at the beginning of this year, while we were kind of still in like that weird phase of the pandemic, like did very well ultimately. And then as time went on and you saw more of like a shift towards movies that were only opening in theaters, those movies were also having like a pretty big box office dividend. So what this past year showed is that theaters are not done entirely, but now more than ever, the impetus is just as much. If anything, there's even more pressure on streaming services. Because like before, streaming services were always like just that nice, cozy alternative to the theater. And that was really all that it was. Yeah, a lot of people were already watching a lot of stuff just on streaming in general. But for the most part, like, especially in 2019, you did see like a really big shift and a lot of movies that were still opening in theaters. Obviously, again, just imagine trying to do Avengers Endgame on a streaming service. It would never work. It would never work. It would never have the pop culture intimacy. Naturally, that's Marvel, and that's one specific sector of the pop culture status. But what I've been saying since the beginning of this whole thing is that all that the pandemic did was kind of fast track something that had already been happening for the last couple of years, which is, to me, streaming becoming a viable, let's call it a more viable, legitimate form of entertainment consumption that we as viewers had already known about for several years. But now to like the higher ups, right? This was like the first time that they actually took streaming seriously, for lack of a better word. Because like before, Amazon had a little bit of things before they had The Boys. Ultimately, Hulu was like the nice alternative, but it really was just Netflix. That's really all that there was for like a solid couple of years. Now, obviously, in the wake of the pandemic and all the new streaming services, there's HBO Max, there's Disney Plus, there's Apple TV Plus, Hulu has really beefed up its programming. There's a whole bunch of others that I'm currently forgetting that popped up. The Peacocks, obviously, is still trying to
Paramount
make waves. Paramount Plus, exactly. Like all of these different streaming services and all of this different like kind of competition that's come up out of nowhere. It's made it obviously a little bit trickier because now it feels like there's twice the content that we had before, but what's it called? But like it feels like nobody knows about any of the new shows. Like there have been like it feels like 500 plus new shows released in the last 2 years, and like nobody really knows about them. So I think what we see going forward, as far as the next phase of kind of the streaming wars, as I call them, is you start to see them hunker down on more big name budget projects like this, because Amazon, right, has obviously, you know, as we've been keeping track of, like, you know, a couple of the moves that they've been making, obviously HBO Max with the dual, like, releasing in theaters and on the streaming service for a month, and then obviously with with Apple TV Plus, and kind of how Apple is kind of like trying to scoop up all like the prestige directors that Netflix had previously. Like Apple is funding Scorsese's next 2 movies, both the upcoming Killers of the Flower Moon and the Grateful Dead Jerry Garcia movie with Jonah Hill that was just announced. They're obviously doing Joel Cohen's Tragedy of Macbeth. So that seems to be like Apple seems to be focused entirely on prestige filmmaking, right? But Apple still has yet to have like a breakout hit outside of like Ted Lasso, really. And Amazon, this is Amazon's next big move as far as like, okay, we are cornering the market on like kind of the biggest possible TV show. Like when we have a TV show out, we want it to be big and we want it to be the focus of the pop culture. And I think that they've done that ultimately. So now I guess the only other thing that I really wanted to talk to you about before we wrap this up is, without spoiling anything, obviously, for what's going forward, obviously, both obviously for this season and the season to come, because this thing has already been greenlit for 2 more seasons. 2 more. Like, you were the one that was even texting me. It's like, wow, this already got greenlit for a 3rd season. I'd seen it already, but I was like, that's crazy. I'm like, this show hasn't even started airing for them. So they clearly have a lot of confidence in this property going forward. So without spoiling anything, where is it that we're going as far as on this journey that we have going forward? What is it that we have to expect, like as far as like fantasy creatures, other fantasy tropes and stories, kind of like the nature of where this could go within like kind of the television pop culture sphere? Like what is it that we have to look forward to over the next couple of years?
Well, I will say you're going to see a lot more fantastical stuff. Obviously, you say, you know, all these different fantasy races, Trollocs and Thades, they're not the only ones in this world. There are a lot of interesting creatures and just people that you're going to meet. There's a lot of different factions at play within this world. Obviously, we've already met like the White Cloak, so I know it obviously seems a little menacing, and
just a little bit
with that opening in the 2nd episode.
Like that was another Ice City that the dude was like just straight up burning at the beginning, right?
Right.
Definitely a lot of Salem witch trial what's it called, allusions right there.
Right, and they play a big role in the series. Their whole I guess ideology is that anyone who can wield magic or channel is evil. Like just no, like bottom line, no exceptions. You use magic, that's the Dark One's power. You know, you're evil. So that's kind of their way of thinking to kind of sum up why they do what they do. But in terms of just the overall story arc, I know we've talked about like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones a lot, and it really seems like we're going in a Lord of the Rings kind of direction. But I will tell you, this story, you'll know when it happens, but this story gets flipped on its head. And we transition from a Lord of the Rings kind of story into a more Game of Thrones kind of story, where there's a lot more political maneuvering and just kind of complex characters. There's a lot of like gray morality situations will be thrown into, and it's going to be really interesting to see how our characters grow and develop through this. And there's a lot of death, I will say. There's a lot of twists and turns throughout the road, and I think I really can't wait for a few moments in particular just within this first season.
That's so fascinating, because like that's kind of amazing, because you're right, because like watching these first 3 episodes, I was definitely getting like a major Lord of the Rings vibe, but I was also like, I'm like, they obviously can't do Lord of the Rings for this whole thing, because that would just make it like another Lord of the Rings. But like that's really fascinating. And obviously the other interesting thing too, right? So obviously we talk about it, Lord of the Rings, we know the fantasy elements are all there from the beginning. We see all the creatures, we see obviously the Nazgul and everything, and those just get amped up as time goes on. And then the interesting thing about Game of Thrones is that, with the exception of the setting that it takes place in, Game of Thrones almost functions as like a normal show for lack of a better word, that's just about like human drama and politics.
Yep.
And then they lace in the more specific fantasy elements later on. But that's really interesting to me how it sounds like this series is almost going to be playing like the reverse, where you're locked in because of the fantasy first going forward. And then as time goes on, you start to see like more of the political maneuvering between factions. I feel like that's something that we really haven't gotten from the fantasy genre as a mainstream element. And I feel like that's something that can actually be like really fascinating going forward and kind of seeing like what that does to the story overall. Cause I mean, I don't know, you tell me, but like me personally, I thought that like since the fantasy elements were so hyped up to be like the third act of the show, and obviously since we know they surpassed the books, I personally think that the fantasy elements were probably some of the weakest handled stuff in Game of Thrones, to the point where it felt like they were just kind of like using it as at their disposal as, you know, time goes on willy-nilly. And obviously we know that fantasy and magic is one of those things that it's like you have to explain the rules, or else it's kind of just becomes like a plot device and it makes the story boring ultimately. And I'm guessing there's a lot of rules like surrounding the magic. It's another one of those things where if you use too much of it, it starts to drain you, as we see with Moraine in these first couple episodes. And obviously it becomes pretty clear that like one of these male characters is going to be able to unlock their magic, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems going forward. And I'm assuming that there are other factions that are going to be coming in besides like what was it? Besides the white cloak that come in. But it definitely looks like we've got a lot to look forward to going forward. So before we wrap it up, ultimately, so I want to hear, so what are your final thoughts on these first 3 episodes, and give them a star rating out of 5.
Out of 5, huh? Well, overall, I think these episodes, they do a really good job of setting everything up that is to come. They have a lot to throw in, obviously. There's like a lot of characters. There's a lot of just elements moving forward, obviously, like the talking about dark friends and just people that are kind of in secret working for the Shadow, and just the whole world they need to kind of just hype up and just show what's to come and what kind of things we can expect to see moving forward, because we've hardly seen anything in the true scope of the series. We've barely seen anything, but there's still a lot to explain before we see what we need to see, obviously, later on. So I think, although it's not perfect, obviously, I do think these episodes do a fantastic job, and I think that Amazon really does have a good understanding of the source material, and that I think they really have the right people for, especially the cast. I think the cast is almost perfect, especially Matt Cawthon's character. I love his actor, and I'm so sad that he won't be returning for the second season. They'll have to recast him. He'll be leaving due to personal issues, but I think him in particular, he is spot on with his character in the book, and I think we will see that they will grow into their roles as the show progresses, and I'm really looking forward to see it. So if I have to give it a star rating, I would say I would give it a 4 out of 5. Not perfect, but I think it's heading in the right direction, and I think it can be much better as it progresses.
Nice. Is Matt the one with the scar on his leg, or is Matt the one that was like the gambler that was looking out for his sisters?
Matt's the wisecracking gambler.
Okay, so he's that dude. Oh man, so they already recast, and that was the thing that like didn't happen because of any sort of thing that happens in the books, right? That was just the actor left for personal reasons.
The actor is just leaving for personal reasons.
That sucks. I really like that dude. I really like. Yeah. Damn, we're already getting with the recasting games. Always why does that always happen? Why is it there's always the recastings that happen in the fantasy show? It happened with 8 different characters across the scope of Game of Thrones. Like, why does that keep happening? I don't get it.
Oh, I know, it's crazy. Yeah.
Real quick thing that I wanted to ask you, but last thing before we got out of there. So the city that they stop at the end of episode 2, the what's it called? The
Shadar Logoth.
Yeah, that's it. That weird like kind of shadow thing that's creeping up that dissolves the one horse. Like, is that like a thing having to do with the Dark Lord, or is that like something else completely different, like within the city?
That is just the evil within the city.
Okay.
We're going to see a lot of things like that throughout the show. There are these own individual places that are kind of either like they're cursed, or there's just like there's something off about it, and we're gonna see it's very much like a Lord of the Rings kind of world, where a lot of places we visit have these really like complex, like layered histories, and it just makes it so much more interesting for like all the characters and just the cultures we're gonna see in different societies and things like that. And I'm really excited to see what they have to show.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, because like I saw that and I'm like, oh shit. Like that now we're really getting into this. Like that's always the thing that I love. Like I remember like when I was like kind of like looking up points of like how to write a good fantasy story technically. And one of the first things that came up was it's like, yeah, just come up with a bunch of stories that like happen within the history of your world. Like that, because that's the whole thing, right? Whenever you're writing a fantasy story, you want the world to be like the number one thing that like locks people in. So you want to come up with like a bunch of different stories about like the kind of the history of the world in general. And already like I'm finding that really fascinating, where it feels like every location that they're going to go to is like going to have like all these different like kind of instances. And I felt like that's something that I really, really loved about Game of Thrones. And that's something that I'm really interested to see going forward here. So as far as my final thoughts here, again, for me, definitely, again, I still have relative little experience with a lot of Amazon properties, so I can't say how this measures to previous Amazon properties. But as far as this being like kind of the kind of new instance of like kind of like the first chapter in like what could be a really long running and really memorable and big and growing TV series over time, definitely locked me in, definitely hooked me in. I'm very, very much intrigued. Definitely has me in a sense of where I want to see where the rest of this first season goes before I check out the books. But if this first season definitely locks me in the way that I'm hoping it does, I'm definitely gonna start checking out that book series, because it's been a long time since I've had like a book series that like really, really draws me in. Love the look of the world. I love the feeling of it. I love just the sense of like kind of that raw adventure mixed with peril. Like we haven't gotten that from a property just in so long. And yeah, it was a very, very good first 3 episodes. Not amazing, but very good. I think you were spot on there with your sentiment. 4 out of 5 stars from me as well. So with that being said, that was it. That was our review and recap of the first 3 episodes of Wheel of Time. Eli, thanks so much for coming on for this, dude. You absolutely crushed it. And definitely, I will say, I may definitely want to have you back on in a couple of weeks. Once we see the finale to see where this could go going forward. And definitely we'll have to keep an eye on this and see if this ends up becoming like kind of the next big thing, because you always see this with these shows, right? The first season comes out, it's kind of like a low-key hit, like very rarely is it like a huge big publicity hit, but then as it grows over time, those are the shows we have to look out for. And hopefully, since the books are already written and not still being written,
right,
we'll be able to see like the true adaptation of this done and not like have to like worry about it. It's like, oh no, what's going to happen once they're in uncharted territory? But I definitely don't think we're going to have that problem. So before we get out of here, Eli, where can the good people find you on the interwebs, just in general? So any social media handles you may have that you want to promote?
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone's interested in following me, I have an Instagram. Username is E_Holicky 45. That is just HOLICKY 45. And yeah, that's pretty much the only like really public thing I have. I don't have a Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. But
well, I mean, you're definitely gonna have to get that going if you want to continue in this media sphere, unfortunately. Even though I will say for the first, like Twitter is one of the most toxic places that you could ever be. So avoid that shit like the plague.
Completely understand.
And you can, of course, follow me at Movie Nerd Reviews on Facebook and Instagram. And more importantly, follow us on the Talkin' TV social media pages at Talkin' TV Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, where we post every single day, twice a day. We've been a little bit lax these past couple of weeks, but we're going to finish out the year strong. We've got House of Gucci next week. And then December, we've got it. Power of the Dog, West Side Story. Then we're wrapping up the year with Spider-Man and Matrix. We've got a ton more content. Pat and I are still going strong. We're almost done. We just did by the time this episode goes up, we'll have just done the Reigns of Castamere episode 29 for our Talking Thrones series. Obviously, famously, the Red Wedding episode. We'll have 3 more episodes of Talking Thrones before we wrap that up for the year, before continuing with that next year. And as always, people, remember, click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell next to it. That way you guys get notified every time we put up new stuff. Make sure you leave your comments in the comment section below about your thoughts on the Wheel of Time series. And be sure to follow this guy. He definitely knows the stuff when it comes to this sort of stuff. And as always, people, remember, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.